Michael Reed turned 52 on a rainy Thursday in late March, the kind of Portland rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder but simply arrives, soft and persistent, like an old friend who never quite leaves. He woke up at 6:47 a.m. as he always did, even on days when there was no reason to set an alarm. The bedroom smelled faintly of cedar from the small diffuser Caitlin had placed on the nightstand 6 months earlier. To help you sleep deeper, honey, you've been so restless lately. He lay there for a minute listening to the rain tap against the metal roof of the little house on Riverbend Lane, a modest 2-story craftsman built in 1948 that he and Laura had bought right after their wedding. Laura. Even now, 3 years after the funeral, her name still landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Leukemia had come fast and merciless, diagnosed at 41, gone by 43. 18 years of marriage reduced to a box of photographs, her favorite teacup still in the cupboard, and a quiet ache that never quite left the edges of his days. He had spent the first 2 years after her death in a kind of gentle hibernation, work at the engineering firm, structural assessments for bridges and commercial buildings, home to read blueprints or watch documentaries about ocean currents, occasional dinners with old college friends who never knew quite what to say anymore. Then came the animal shelter volunteer shift on a Saturday in April. 3 years ago, almost to the day. Caitlin Brooks had been there sorting donations, boxes of kibble, old blankets, leashes that needed untangling. She wore a faded green hoodie with the sleeves pushed up, her dark auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and when she laughed at something one of the shelter dogs did, a clumsy golden retriever puppy trying to steal a tennis ball from a much larger lab, the sound cut through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Michael had been restocking the cat food aisle. Their hands brushed when they both reached for the same bag of grain-free kibble. "Sorry," he said automatically. She smiled, not the polite half-smile people give strangers, but something warmer, more curious. No harm done. You volunteering long. That was how it started. Simple. Ordinary. Dangerous in its ordinariness. They talked for 40 minutes that afternoon while folding towels and refilling water bowls. She was 45, originally from Dallas but had lived in 4 different states over the last decade chasing sales jobs that kept promising more and delivering less. Recently divorced, amicable, mostly, she said with a small shrug, and she had moved to Portland because the rain felt honest. Michael told her about Laura, not the polished version he used at work parties, but the real one, how she used to sing off key while gardening, how she collected vintage postcards from places she'd never visited, how the last thing she said to him in the hospital was "Don't forget to water the ferns." Caitlin listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes. When he finished, she simply said, "That kind of love doesn't vanish. It changes shape, that's all." They exchanged numbers for shelter updates, but the first text came that evening, a photo of the clumsy golden retriever puppy asleep on a pile of blankets. He's dreaming of tennis balls. Thought you'd like to see. Michael stared at the screen longer than he meant to. Something inside him, something that had been locked away for years, stirred. The next few weeks passed in a gentle acceleration. Coffee at a small place on Hawthorne with mismatched mugs and too loud indie music. Walks along the Willamette River Trail when the sun managed to break through. A movie night at his place. Some old black and white Hitchcock film neither of them paid much attention to because they were too busy talking. She moved in 7 months after that first meeting, bringing 2 suitcases, a box of cookbooks, and a small potted fern she insisted on placing next to Laura's in the living room window. They can keep each other company, she said, and Michael felt a pang that was equal parts gratitude and guilt. The house changed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Caitlin repainted the kitchen cabinets a soft sage green, brings in more light. She rearranged the bookshelves so the engineering textbooks shared space with her collection of contemporary poetry and self-help titles about resilience and second chances. She bought new throw pillows for the couch, velvet ones in deep teal, and hung a macrame wall hanging she had made herself during a particularly boring sales conference in Reno. Michael liked the changes. They felt like proof that life could move forward without erasing what came before. Every morning she made him a smoothie. The ritual began innocently enough. "You've been looking tired, Michael. Let me make you something that actually gives you energy instead of just coffee." The blender word at 7:05 a.m. sharp. Kale, banana, frozen berries, a scoop of plant-based protein powder, chia seeds, a teaspoon of spirulina, and whatever new superfood she had ordered online that week. Maca root 1 month, ashwagandha the next, lion's mane mushroom after that. The color was always an alarming green, but she insisted it tasted better than it looked. "Close your eyes and pretend it's a pina colada," she'd tease, handing him the glass with a kiss on the cheek. He drank it every day. For her. Because she cared. Their routine settled into something comfortable, almost idyllic. Saturday mornings they jogged together along the Springwater Corridor Trail, 3 miles out, 3 back, stopping halfway to watch the river move slow and grey under the bridges. Caitlin ran with easy grace. Michael, who had never been athletic, found himself keeping pace more out of pride than stamina. Afterward, they'd sit on a bench with thermoses of herbal tea she brewed the night before. Chamomile and peppermint, she'd say. Calms the nerves. He liked the way she noticed things, the way the cottonwoods were starting to bud, the heron that always stood in the same shallow spot, the precise moment the sun finally burned off the morning mist. Afternoons were for errands or quiet projects. Caitlin took over the household finances with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she told him one evening while sorting through a stack of bills at the kitchen table. "Let me handle the boring stuff, insurance renewals, credit card statements, the HSA contributions. You focus on the big picture work." Michael hesitated at first. He had always managed the money, but she was so organized, so calm, so grateful when he finally handed over the passwords. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered, kissing his knuckles. He felt lighter somehow, unburdened. Evenings were their favorite time. Dinner was usually something simple she cooked: roasted salmon with asparagus, quinoa salad with feta and pomegranate seeds, or vegetable stir-fry with ginger and tamari. They ate at the small table by the window overlooking the river, candles flickering even on weeknights. Afterward, they'd move to the living room couch. Sometimes they watched documentaries, Michael's choice, anything about infrastructure, oceanography, or deep-sea exploration. Sometimes old movies, Caitlin's choice, anything with Audrey Hepburn or Cary Grant. Sometimes they just talked. About nothing. About everything. About how strange it was to find love again when you thought that chapter was closed forever. Sophia noticed. Of course she did. His daughter was 24, in her final year of a master's program in environmental policy at the University of Washington in Seattle. She came down every 6 weeks or so, staying in the guest room that still smelled faintly of Laura's lavender sachets. The first time she met Caitlin, Thanksgiving, year 1, Sophia was polite but distant. After dinner, while Caitlin was loading the dishwasher, Sophia pulled Michael into the hallway. "Dad," she whispered, eyes searching his face. "She's nice. Really nice. But it's fast. 3 months from meeting to moving in? You sure you're not just lonely?" Michael had smiled, patted her arm. "I was lonely, Soph, for a long time. Caitlin makes the days feel fuller. Isn't that enough?" Sophia bit her lip. "Just be careful. Okay. Promise me you'll tell me if anything feels off. Even a little." He promised. He meant it. But nothing felt off. Not then. Caitlin did have accidents, though. Small ones, scattered across the months like crumbs. First it was the ankle, late July, during one of their jogs. She twisted it on an uneven patch of trail, limped the last mile home. Michael iced it, wrapped it in an ACE bandage, drove her to urgent care the next morning. Grade 1 sprain, the doctor said. Rest, ice, elevation. Caitlin laughed it off. See? Clumsy Caitlin strikes again. Then the wrist, October. She came home from a solo grocery run with it taped. Slipped on the wet floor in the produce section. Classic. Michael felt terrible. He should have gone with her. He massaged arnica gel into the bruise every night for a week. The rib thing happened in January. She said she fell off a step stool while reaching for a mixing bowl on the top shelf. "I'm too short for this kitchen," she joked, wincing when she laughed. Michael took her to the ER, hairline crack in the 8th rib. They taped her up, prescribed ibuprofen, told her to avoid heavy lifting for 6 weeks. He did all the lifting after that, groceries, laundry baskets, even help her change shirts when raising her arms hurt too much. Each time he asked if she was okay. Each time she smiled, kissed him, said, "I'm fine, really. Just me being me." He believed her. Because why wouldn't he? The smoothies continued. Every morning. The taste never improved, chalky, vegetal, faintly metallic, but he drank them anyway. Caitlin watched him swallow the last sip, then took the glass and rinsed it immediately, as if evidence needed to disappear. "Good boy," she'd say playfully, ruffling his hair. He laughed. It felt good to be cared for. Winter turned to spring. The river swelled with snowmelt from the cascades. Cottonwoods along the bank released their seeds, white fluff drifting like snow in reverse. Michael's energy dipped. Not dramatically at first. Just slower mornings. A heaviness in his legs after their runs. Fingers that tingled when he held a coffee mug too long. Hair coming out in the shower, not handfuls yet, just more than usual clogging the drain. He mentioned it once. Caitlin frowned with concern. You're probably just overdoing it at work. Or maybe it's allergies. Let me add more adaptogens to your smoothie tomorrow. Holy basil and reishi should help. He nodded. Trusted her. Sophia came down for spring break in April. She noticed the hair in the bathroom trash can. The way Michael's hands sometimes trembled when he passed the salt. The faint shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there last Christmas. Dad, she said quietly one evening while Caitlin was out picking up takeout. Are you feeling okay? You look thinner. Just tired, he said. Work's been busy. New bridge retrofit project. Sophia stuttered him. And Caitlin? She's still good to you. Better than good. She's incredible. Sophia didn't push. But when she hugged him goodbye at the airport, she held on longer than usual. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. Promise. Promise. But the promise faded into routine. Smoothies at 7:05. Jog at 7:45. Work. Dinner. Couch. Sleep. Life felt full again, almost perfect. As the weeks following that seemingly ordinary spring morning unfolded into a longer stretch of time than Michael had anticipated, he began to notice how the simple act of rising from bed each day had started to require conscious effort that had not existed before, a kind of deliberate summoning of willpower simply to swing his legs over the edge of the mattress and place his feet on the cool hardwood floor where the morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds in thin, pale stripes. Across the room, the fatigue that settled into his muscles was no longer the familiar tiredness that came after a long day of reviewing structural load calculations or walking the length of a construction site. Instead, it felt deeper, more pervasive, as though his body had begun to carry an invisible weight that pressed downward from somewhere inside his bones, making every movement feel slightly delayed. Slightly heavier than it should have been under normal circumstances. Caitlin observed these changes with what appeared to be genuine concern etched across her features whenever he mentioned feeling unusually drained after what should have been a restful night's sleep, and she would respond by gently placing the back of her hand against his forehead as though checking for fever, her touch cool and reassuring in the way that only someone who truly cared could manage to convey such comfort through the simplest gesture. You've been pushing yourself too hard at the office again, haven't you? She would ask in a voice softened by worry, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he might contradict her gentle diagnosis, and when he shook his head or murmured something vague about perhaps needing more rest, she would nod knowingly and immediately pivot toward practical solutions that always seemed to materialize from her phone or from one of the many wellness websites she followed religiously. The smoothies, which had once felt like a small but thoughtful luxury she prepared each morning as an expression of her affection, gradually took on a more insistent presence in the rhythm of their shared days, and although the taste remained consistently unpleasant, that same chalky, faintly metallic undertone cutting through the attempted sweetness of banana and berries. Michael continued to drink them because refusing would have required an explanation he did not yet have the energy to formulate, and because watching Caitlin's face light up with quiet satisfaction when he finished the entire glass without complaint had become one of the few reliable sources of warmth in an otherwise increasingly foggy routine. She experimented with new ingredients almost weekly, explaining each addition with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a personal mission to restore his vitality. One Tuesday, it was a heaping tablespoon of maca powder because it supports adrenal function and helps combat that mid-morning crash you've been mentioning. The following Thursday, she stirred in a generous scoop of lion's mane mushroom extract, assuring him that studies show it promotes nerve regeneration and clearer thinking, which is exactly what you need right now with all the detail-oriented work piling up on your desk. By late May, the tingling sensation that had begun as an occasional pins and needles feeling in the tips of his fingers and toes had evolved into something more persistent and troubling. A steady burning that radiated upward along the soles of his feet whenever he stood for more than 10 or 15 minutes at a time, making even routine tasks such as standing at the kitchen counter while preparing coffee or waiting in line at the grocery store feel like exercises in quiet endurance rather than ordinary moments of daily life. He mentioned it to Caitlin one evening while they sat together on the couch after dinner, the television murmuring softly in the background with some nature documentary about deep-sea hydrothermal vents that neither of them was truly watching, and she listened attentively, her head tilted slightly to one side as though weighing every word he spoke before offering her response. That sounds a lot like the peripheral neuropathy I read about in one of those health forums last month, she said thoughtfully, reaching for her phone to pull up an article she had bookmarked weeks earlier, the screen's blue light casting a faint glow across her cheekbones as she scrolled through the text. It's often linked to stress, vitamin deficiencies, or even lingering effects from viruses people don't realize they had. You remember how run down you felt after that cold in February? We should probably get you in to see Dr. Patel again, just to rule out anything serious. But in the meantime, I can adjust the smoothies to include more B vitamins and alpha-lipoic acid. which apparently helps with nerve discomfort in a lot of cases. Michael agreed without much resistance because the alternative, insisting on handling the appointment himself or questioning her suggestions too closely, would have demanded reserves of mental clarity and assertiveness that he found increasingly difficult to summon as the days blended together into a monotonous haze of fatigue and minor discomforts that never quite rose to the level of emergency but refused to subside entirely either. The appointment with Dr. Patel happened the following week, and after a brief physical examination followed by questions about sleep patterns, diet, alcohol consumption, and recent illnesses, the doctor delivered a diagnosis that felt both reassuringly familiar and vaguely unsettling at the same time: early signs of peripheral neuropathy possibly compounded by chronic fatigue syndrome, with stress listed as the most likely contributing factor given Michael's recent workload on the bridge, retrofit project and the emotional residue of widowhood that, according to Dr. Patel, could manifest physically even years later. Caitlin sat beside him during the consultation, taking notes on her phone with efficient taps of her fingers, occasionally glancing up to ask clarifying questions about recommended lifestyle changes, supplements, and follow-up tests that the doctor suggested might be prudent if symptoms persisted beyond another month or two. When they left the office, she slipped her arm through his as they walked to the car, squeezing gently in a gesture of solidarity that made him feel supported rather than diminished. And on the drive home, she spoke optimistically about how manageable the condition sounded once they addressed the root causes through rest, better nutrition, and perhaps a reduction in his overtime hours at the firm. "We'll get through this together," she promised, her voice steady and warm, and for a moment Michael allowed himself to believe that the explanation made perfect sense, that his body was simply reacting to accumulated strain in ways that modern medicine could catalogue and eventually correct. As summer deepened and the days lengthened with that particular Pacific Northwest softness where twilight lingered well past 9 o'clock, Michael found himself withdrawing from social contacts that had once provided balance to his life. A process so gradual he scarcely registered it until weeks had passed, and he realized how few messages appeared on his phone from old colleagues or friends who used to suggest grabbing a beer after work or meeting for a weekend hike along the Columbia River. Gorge. Caitlin never explicitly discouraged these connections, yet her comments carried a subtle weight that nudged him towards staying home more often. "You look exhausted just thinking about going out tonight. Why don't we keep it simple and watch that new series instead? Or your feet have been bothering you all day. A quiet evening here would probably do you more good than standing around in a noisy bar." Over time, these gentle suggestions accumulated into a pattern where declining invitations became the default response, and although part of him registered a faint pang of loneliness when another text went unanswered or another weekend passed without plans beyond the house by the river, the fatigue itself provided a convenient rationale that silenced any deeper questioning. Caitlin's own mishaps continued to punctuate their days with small interruptions that required his attention and sympathy, each incident reinforcing the sense that she too was navigating vulnerability even as she positioned herself as his primary caregiver. In early June, she returned from a yoga class with her right ankle wrapped in athletic tape, explaining that she had misstepped during a warrior pose transition and felt a sharp pop that left her limping across the studio parking lot. Michael helped her ice the swelling that evening while she reclined on the couch with her leg elevated on pillows, apologizing repeatedly for being such a klutz, and thanking him profusely for his patience, as though her injury represented an imposition rather than something he felt honored to assist with. 2 weeks later, it was her left wrist, allegedly sprained when she caught herself awkwardly after tripping over the garden hose while watering the ferns on the back patio, and although the bruise bloomed dark purple across the delicate skin above her thumb, she insisted on continuing to prepare his morning smoothies despite the discomfort, using her right hand almost exclusively and laughing softly at her own determination to keep their routine intact. The rib injury that arrived in mid-July proved more disruptive because the pain restricted her breathing and made even light household tasks difficult. She described slipping on the top step of the garage stairs while carrying a box of old holiday decorations down from the attic storage, claiming the wood had been slick from overnight condensation and that she had landed hard against the concrete floor below. Michael drove her to urgent care that same afternoon, sitting beside her in the examination room while the doctor confirmed a hairline fracture in the 9th rib and recommended rest, over-the-counter pain relief, and avoidance of any twisting or lifting motions for at least 6 to 8 weeks. During the recovery period, he assumed responsibility for grocery shopping, laundry, meal preparation, and even helping her change into loose clothing when raising her arms caused sharp stabs of discomfort. And although these tasks exhausted him more than he cared to admit, he performed them willingly because caring for her in her moments of need felt like a reciprocal expression of the devotion she showed him every morning with the green concoction she blended so carefully. Throughout these overlapping periods of mutual fragility, Caitlin maintained an air of quiet competence that made her seem indispensable. She renewed insurance policies before reminders arrived, tracked medication refills with calendar alerts on her phone, organized his work documents into neatly labeled folders so he could find anything without effort even on days when his concentration faltered, and always had a fresh thermos of herbal tea waiting when he returned from the office or reassuring hand on his shoulder when the burning in his feet became particularly insistent after standing too long at his drafting table. Michael noticed how conversations with friends had dwindled to occasional check-in texts that he answered with brief assurances that everything was fine, just busy, and how invitations to barbecues or weekend fishing trips were met with polite regrets because things have been a bit hectic lately with health stuff. The isolation crept in so softly that it resembled comfort rather than confinement, and by the time August arrived with its warm afternoons and long golden evenings, he had almost convinced himself that this narrowing of his world represented a natural evolution of middle age rather than something deliberate or troubling. Yet beneath the surface of these normalized routines, small dissonances began to accumulate in ways that Michael registered only in fleeting moments of clarity before fatigue pulled him back under. The way Caitlin always rinsed his smoothie glass immediately after he finished drinking, sometimes before he had even set it down. The faint metallic aftertaste that lingered longer each week despite her assurances that the new protein powder brand was supposed to mask it better. The occasional flash of impatience in her eyes when he asked a second time about a bill she had already explained, or when he hesitated before handing over yet another login credential for an account she said needed updating. These observations floated past like leaves on the river outside their window, noticed, acknowledged briefly, then carried away by the current of exhaustion that made sustained scrutiny feel impossible. By early September, the burning in his extremities had intensified to the point where walking barefoot across the kitchen floor felt like stepping onto heated gravel, and the hair loss, which had started as a minor annoyance in the shower drain, had progressed to noticeable thinning at the crown and temples that even casual acquaintances commented on during rare video calls. Caitlin responded to these developments with increased attentiveness, researching obscure supplements late into the night and ordering bottles that arrived in discreet brown packages she opened eagerly at the kitchen table while explaining their purported benefits for nerve repair and energy restoration. "We are going to turn this around," she told him one evening as she measured out a new combination of powders into the blender, her voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who refused to accept defeat. And although part of Michael wanted to believe her completely, another part, small, buried, but persistent, began to wonder why recovery always seemed to require more rather than less of the very mixture that had become the centerpiece of their mornings together. Everything began to unravel on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday morning in early October, when Caitlin woke up complaining of a sharp, stabbing pain in her wisdom tooth that had been building quietly for several days and had finally reached the point where even speaking or chewing on the unaffected side of her mouth sent jolts of discomfort radiating through her jaw, making her wince visibly every time she tried to take a normal bite of breakfast or sip her coffee without grimacing, and Michael, seeing the genuine distress etched across her features as she pressed her fingertips gently against the swollen area beneath her cheekbone, immediately offered to accompany her to the appointment she had already scheduled at the modern dental clinic downtown on Southwest Morrison Street. Because he knew how much she disliked medical procedures when she had to face them alone, and because the simple act of being there beside her felt like one small way he could repay the constant care she had been showing him through all his own accumulating health struggles over the past months. They left the house together shortly after 9 o'clock, driving through the familiar streets of Portland where the autumn leaves had already begun turning shades of deep gold and rusty orange along the sidewalks and in the small neighborhood parks, the air outside carrying that crisp, slightly damp scent of fallen foliage mixed with a faint wood smoke from someone's chimney nearby. And when they arrived at the clinic, the receptionist greeted them with practiced warmth, handed Caitlin a clipboard with the usual forms to update her medical history, and directed them to wait in the softly lit reception area where low instrumental music played quietly overhead and magazines about travel and home design lay neatly fanned out on the low glass table in front of the upholstered chairs. Michael sat beside her, holding her hand loosely while she filled out the paperwork, noticing how her handwriting, usually so neat and deliberate, trembled slightly on the lines where she had to list any recent injuries or ongoing pain. And when she handed the forms back, she gave him a small, grateful smile that made his chest tighten with affection because even in discomfort she still managed to reassure him that everything would be fine. Dr. Laura Mendez, the dentist who had been recommended by a colleague at work several years earlier and whom Caitlin had seen once before for routine cleaning, called her back after only a short wait, and Michael followed them down the hallway lined with framed posters promoting gum health and the benefits of electric toothbrushes until they reached the treatment room where the overhead light was bright but not harsh. The chair reclined smoothly as Caitlin settled into it, and the assistant adjusted the bib around her neck while Dr. Mendez pulled on fresh gloves and began the examination with the calm efficiency that comes from decades of practice. At first, everything proceeded as expected. Caitlin opened her mouth. The dentist used the small mirror and explorer to probe gently around the painful area, asked a few standard questions about the onset of the pain, its intensity on a scale of 1 to 10, whether it radiated to her ear or neck, and whether she had noticed any swelling or fever accompanying the discomfort, and Caitlin answered honestly, explaining that the pain had started mildly about a week earlier but had grown steadily. Worse over the last 3 days to the point where she could barely sleep through the night without waking up every few hours. After several minutes of careful inspection, Dr. Mendez decided that a panoramic X-ray would be necessary to get a clearer view of the wisdom tooth's position and to check for any signs of infection, abscess, or impaction that might explain the severity of the symptoms. So the assistant led Caitlin to the adjacent imaging room where she stood with her chin resting on a small plastic support while the machine rotated slowly around her head, emitting a low mechanical hum and a faint click as it captured the full arc of her jaws and surrounding structures. And Michael waited in the hallway outside, scrolling absently through his phone and thinking about how grateful he was that this seemed like a straightforward dental issue rather than another mysterious symptom added to the growing list of his own unexplained ailments over the past year. When Caitlin returned to the treatment chair, Dr. Mendez studied the digital images on the large monitor mounted on the wall, zooming in and out on different sections with the mouse while occasionally making quiet notes on her tablet. And although Michael could not see the screen clearly from where he sat, he noticed the subtle change in the dentist's posture. The way her shoulders stiffened slightly and her brow furrowed in concentration as she scrolled back and forth across one particular area, near the lower left jaw. And after a long moment of silence that felt heavier than it should have, Dr. Mendez turned to Caitlin and asked her to open her mouth again so she could double-check something manually, her voice remaining professionally neutral but carrying an undercurrent of something more serious that made Michael sit up straighter in his chair. What followed happened quickly yet felt stretched out in time as though the air itself had thickened around them. Dr. Mendez excused herself briefly, saying she needed to consult with a colleague about one of the findings, and when she returned a few minutes later she was accompanied not by another dentist but by the clinic manager, a tall woman in her late 40s named Rebecca Klein, who introduced herself with a calm handshake and an expression that combined professional concern with the careful restraint of someone who has delivered difficult news before and knows how fragile these moments can become. They asked Caitlin if she would mind stepping into a private consultation room down the hall so they could discuss the X-ray findings in more detail, and although Caitlin hesitated for a second, glancing at Michael with a flicker of confusion in her eyes, she agreed and rose from the chair, smoothing her sweater as she followed them out of the treatment room while Michael was left waiting alone in the suddenly too quiet space, the instrumental music overhead now sounding oddly distant and the smell of antiseptic sharper than before. Several minutes passed, perhaps 10, perhaps 15, though it felt much longer, before the clinic manager returned and asked Michael if he could come with her to speak privately for a moment, her tone polite but firm in a way that made his stomach drop because he recognized the cadence of someone preparing to deliver information that no one wants to hear. And when he followed her down the corridor to a small office with frosted glass windows and a single potted plant on the windowsill, she closed the door gently behind them and gestured for him to sit in one of the two chairs facing her desk while she took the seat behind it, folding her hands on the surface in front of her as though steadying herself for what came next. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice measured and low so that it would not carry beyond the room, "Dr. Mendez has reviewed your wife's panoramic X-ray in detail, and while the wisdom tooth itself shows signs of partial impaction that may explain some of her current discomfort, there are other findings on the images that have raised serious concerns for both of us. Findings that go beyond routine dental issues and involve structures outside the immediate area of the teeth themselves." She paused, letting the words settle between them before continuing. "The X-ray captures not only the jaws but also portions of the surrounding facial bones and the base of the skull, and in those areas we are seeing multiple healed and healing fractures, some older, some relatively recent, in patterns that do not align with the history of minor household accidents your wife has described to us today." Michael felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when you stand up too quickly after lying down for a long time, and he gripped the arms of the chair to steady himself while Rebecca Klein continued speaking in the same careful, unhurried tone. "There are fractures in the zygomatic arch, the cheekbone, on both sides, one that appears to have healed within the last year or so and another that looks older, perhaps 2 to 3 years. There is evidence of a previous orbital floor fracture around the left eye socket that has remodeled but left detectable changes in bone density, and most concerning of all, there is a relatively fresh linear fracture at the base of the mandible, the lower jaw, that could be no more than 4 to 6 months old, along with several smaller cracks in the condylar region that suggest repeated impact rather than isolated incidents." She turned the monitor on her desk slightly so he could see the X-ray images she had pulled up, pointing with the cursor to the shadowy lines and irregularities that stood out against the white bone structures like cracks in porcelain. And although Michael was not a medical professional, he could see enough to understand that these were not subtle anomalies but clear disruptions in the continuity of the bone, disruptions that told a story very different from the one Caitlin had shared with him over breakfast that morning or during any of the previous conversations about her clumsiness over the past 2 years. "These patterns," Dr. Klein went on, "are highly suggestive of repeated blunt force trauma rather than random falls or household mishaps, and because of the timeline and distribution, we are legally and ethically obligated to report this to Adult Protective Services and potentially to law enforcement if there is any indication of ongoing risk or abuse." The word abuse landed between them like a physical object dropped onto the desk, heavy and impossible to ignore, and Michael felt his mouth go dry as he tried to form a response that would make sense of what he was hearing. I would never hurt her, he managed finally, his voice sounding thin and distant even to his own ears. She's had accidents, she's told me about all of them, slipping on the stairs, falling during yoga, bumping into things. She's always been a little uncoordinated, that's all. Rebecca Klein nodded slowly, her expression remaining compassionate but unwavering. I understand this is overwhelming, Mr. Reed, and I'm not making any accusations against you personally at this moment. I need you to know that, but the medical evidence on these images does not align with the explanations we've been given, and the pattern of multiple fractures at different stages of healing over a relatively short period is something we cannot ignore. Before we proceed with any mandatory reporting, I wanted to speak with you privately to give you an opportunity to provide additional context or history that might explain what we are seeing here. Michael's mind raced through every memory of Caitlin's injuries he could recall: the ankle sprain on the trail last summer, the wrist from the grocery store fall, the rib fracture from the garage stairs just a few months earlier, and suddenly each one felt different when viewed through the lens of these X-ray images, as though the stories she had told him. Stories he had accepted without question because he loved her and because doubting her would have meant doubting the entire foundation of their life together, were now being reframed by lines of fractured bone that told a parallel narrative he had never been allowed to see. He asked if he could speak with Caitlin, and Rebecca Klein agreed but suggested they move to a larger consultation room where everyone could sit together, and as they walked back down the hallway, Michael felt the floor beneath his feet become unsteady, the antiseptic smell stronger, the fluorescent lights overhead brighter and more clinical than they had seemed only half an hour earlier when everything still felt normal. When they entered the consultation room, Caitlin was already there, seated at the round table with her arms crossed tightly over her chest and her face pale but composed, though Michael could see the tension in the set of her jaw and the way her fingers dug into the sleeves of her sweater as though anchoring herself against whatever was coming next. Dr. Mendez and Rebecca Klein took seats across from them, and after a brief silence, Dr. Mendez spoke first, explaining the X-ray findings in the same measured terms she had used with Michael earlier, pointing to printed copies of the images spread out on the table so Caitlin could see exactly what they were discussing. And when she finished, she asked gently whether Caitlin had ever experienced any significant head or facial trauma in the past: a car accident, a fall from height, sports injury, domestic incident, anything that might account for the multiple healed fractures visible on the scan. Caitlin listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the images for several long seconds before she lifted her eyes to meet Dr. Mendez's and answered in a voice that was steady but edged with something sharper underneath. No, nothing like that. I've never had a major accident or injury to my face or head. The things I told you about, the ankle, the wrist, the ribs, those were just clumsy moments, everyday falls, nothing more. I don't understand why the X-ray would show anything else. Dr. Mendez nodded, acknowledging the response without dismissing it, and then asked more specifically about the most recent fracture line in the lower jaw, explaining that its appearance suggested it had occurred within the last few months rather than years, and Caitlin shook her head firmly, insisting she had not experienced any blow to the face or jaw during that time frame, that she would remember something so significant if it had happened, and that perhaps the imaging machine had picked up an artifact or a shadow that was being misinterpreted. The conversation continued in this careful back and forth for nearly 40 minutes, with Dr. Mendez and Rebecca Klein asking detailed questions about each reported injury, exact dates, circumstances, whether she had sought medical treatment beyond urgent care, whether police or insurance companies had been involved, and Caitlin answering with increasing defensiveness, her voice rising slightly as she repeated that she was simply accident-prone, that she had always been this way, that none of it was suspicious or deliberate, and that she felt deeply insulted by the implication that she might be fabricating injuries or that someone in her life was causing them intentionally. Michael sat beside her through it all, his hand resting on her knee under the table in what he hoped was a supportive gesture, but inside his mind was spinning with fragments of memory colliding against the evidence laid out on the table in black and white images, the way she had winced when turning her head too quickly last month, claiming it was a stiff neck from sleeping wrong, the faint discoloration under her left eye that she had covered with makeup and explained as an allergy flare-up, the night she had woken up suddenly with a gasp and then brushed it off as a bad dream when he asked if she was all right. Each recollection now carried a different weight, a shadow he had never noticed before, and although he wanted desperately to believe Caitlin's explanations because believing anything else would mean dismantling the entire life they had built together over the past 3 years, the fractures on the screen refused to align with the stories she had told him, and the dissonance between what he saw and what he had accepted began to grow into something sharper and more painful with every passing minute. By the time the meeting ended, with Dr. Mendez explaining that she was required by state law to file a report with Adult Protective Services and that a caseworker would likely contact them within the next few days to discuss next steps, Caitlin was visibly upset, her cheeks flushed and her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her purse and stood up, thanking the doctor and the manager in a voice that was tight with barely controlled anger before turning to Michael and saying quietly but firmly that she wanted to leave immediately. They walked out of the clinic in silence, the autumn air outside feeling colder than when they had arrived, the leaves skittering across the sidewalk in small eddies driven by a sudden breeze. And when they reached the car, Caitlin slid into the passenger seat without a word, staring straight ahead through the windshield while Michael started the engine and pulled out into traffic, his own thoughts churning in a storm of confusion, guilt, protectiveness, and a growing, unnamed fear that refused to be silenced no matter how hard he tried to push it down. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes because of construction on the freeway, and during that time neither of them spoke beyond the occasional direction or comment about traffic, but the silence between them was thick with everything that had not yet been said, and when they finally pulled into the driveway of their house by the river, Michael turned off the ignition and sat there for a long moment with his hands still on the wheel, staring at the familiar front porch where the potted ferns Caitlin had placed beside Laura's old ones were now turning slightly brown at the edges from the cooler weather, before he finally turned to her and asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment Dr. Mendez first pointed to those fracture lines on the screen. "Caitlin, is there anything you haven't told me? About the injuries? About what's been happening? Because what they showed us today, it doesn't match what you've said, and I need to understand." She looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to gauge how much he already suspected, and after a long pause she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly before speaking in a voice that trembled only slightly at the edges. "Michael, I swear to you, those x-rays are wrong, or they're being misinterpreted, or maybe there's some medical condition I don't know about that makes my bones show up strangely. But I have never lied to you about the accidents. They happened exactly the way I told you. I'm clumsy, I've always been clumsy, and I hate that it's making you doubt me now, especially when you're the one who's been struggling with your health for so long. Please don't let them turn this into something it isn't." He wanted to believe her, more than anything he wanted to believe her, because the alternative meant questioning not just her stories but the entire foundation of trust they had built, the mornings with smoothies, the evenings on the couch, the way she had stepped into his life and made the empty spaces feel filled again after years of loneliness. And so he nodded slowly, squeezing her hand back, and told her they would figure it out together, that he would call Adult Protective Services, himself if necessary to clarify everything, that he loved her and refused to let a misunderstanding destroy what they had. But even as he said the words, even as they walked inside the house together and she went straight to the kitchen to make tea while he sat on the couch trying to process what had happened, a small, insistent part of his mind refused to let go of the images he had seen, those clean, unmistakable lines of broken bone at different stages of healing, and the quiet, growing realization that the life he thought he knew was beginning to fracture in ways he could no longer ignore or explain away with. Simple reassurances. That evening passed in a strange, suspended tension. Dinner was quiet, the food tasted like nothing. Conversation stayed surface level with both of them carefully avoiding the subject of the dental visit as though naming it would make the fracture lines more real. And when they finally went to bed, Caitlin curled against him the way she always did, her head on his shoulder and her arm draped across his chest, whispering good night in a voice that sounded almost normal. But Michael lay awake long. After her breathing evened out into sleep, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the streetlight outside moved slowly across the plaster, replaying every detail of the day in his mind and wondering how many other things he had failed to see clearly while the burning in his feet and the fog in his thoughts grew steadily worse with each passing hour. The next morning Caitlin made his smoothie as usual, the blender whirring at 7:05 exactly. The green liquid swirling in the glass she handed him with a small, hopeful smile, and although he drank it because refusing would have escalated the tension that already hung between them like smoke, the metallic aftertaste seemed stronger than ever, lingering on his tongue long after he swallowed the last sip. And when she kissed him goodbye before heading out to run errands, he watched her car pull out of the driveway and disappear down Riverbend Lane, feeling for the first time a cold thread of doubt weave itself into the fabric of his certainty about the woman he loved and the life they shared. Over the following days, the unease continued to build in small, relentless increments. Caitlin became more attentive than ever, checking on him constantly, bringing him herbal teas laced with new supplements she ordered overnight, insisting on driving him to work when his hands trembled too much on the steering wheel, and reminding him repeatedly that the dental clinic had overreacted, that x-rays could be misleading, that she would schedule a second opinion with another dentist if it would make him feel better. And although her concern felt genuine, Michael could not shake the memory of those fracture lines or the way Dr. Mendez's voice had changed when she described the pattern of repeated trauma, and each time he tried to bring it up gently, Caitlin would grow tearful or defensive, accusing him of letting strangers plant seeds of doubt in his mind at the very moment when he needed her support most because of his own declining health. He began to notice other discrepancies he had overlooked before, the way certain cabinets in her home office were always locked even though she claimed they contained only old tax documents, the faint scent of rubbing alcohol that sometimes lingered in the bathroom after she showered, as though she had been cleaning small wounds he never saw, the occasional late-night phone calls she took in the guest room with the door closed, her voice muffled but urgent, ending abruptly whenever he approached, and the growing stack of unopened mail addressed to her personally that arrived in envelopes from insurance companies whose names he did not recognize. Mail she collected quickly from the box and carried straight to her office without comment. One evening after she had gone to bed early complaining of a headache, Michael sat alone in the living room with his laptop open on the coffee table. The screens glowed the only light in the dark room, and after hesitating for nearly 20 minutes he typed her name into the search bar along with the words insurance claims and accidents, not expecting to find anything but hoping somehow to quiet the doubts that had taken root. And when the first few results appeared, public records of personal injury claims filed in Oregon and Texas under Caitlin Brooks with dates that matched several of her mishaps over the past 2 years. He felt his pulse quicken as he clicked through to the limited public summaries that showed payouts totaling nearly $300,000 across multiple policies, none of which had ever been mentioned in their shared financial conversations, none of which had appeared in the joint accounts she now managed so efficiently on his behalf. He closed the laptop slowly, his hands shaking more violently than they had in weeks, and sat in the dark listening to the river outside moving steadily past the house, the same river that had once felt peaceful and constant now sounding like it carried something heavier downstream, something he could no longer pretend not to hear. And in that moment, the small thread of doubt that had begun in the dental office widened into a crack that threatened to split everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping in the next room, about the smoothies she made with such care, about the life they had built together on a foundation that was suddenly feeling far less solid than he had ever imagined. The river outside continued its steady, indifferent movement past the house that night, the low murmur of water against the bank filtering through the closed windows in a rhythm that had once felt soothing but now carried an undertone of something relentless and unstoppable. Much like the current of questions that had begun to flow through Michael's mind with increasing force after he closed the laptop and sat motionless in the darkened living room for what must have been nearly an hour, the only illumination coming from the faint blue glow of the streetlight filtering through the half-drawn curtains and casting long, wavering shadows across the hardwood floor where a few stray leaves from Caitlin's potted ferns had fallen earlier that day and now lay curled and forgotten near the base of the coffee table. He did not turn on any lamps because light would have felt too exposing, too harsh against the fragile equilibrium he was trying to maintain between the life he had believed in for 3 years and the evidence that had just appeared on his screen in the form of searchable public records showing claim after claim filed under Caitlin Brooks' name with dates that aligned almost perfectly with every clumsy accident she had described to him over breakfast or while they sat together on the couch in the evenings, each payout listed in dry numerical detail: $42,750 for a wrist fracture in October of the previous year, $78,300 for rib injuries in July, small amounts for sprains and contusions that added up steadily until the total across multiple policies approached the figure he had glimpsed before panic made him shut the browser tab. And although the records themselves contained no narrative explanation beyond the standard codes for slip and fall or household accident, the sheer volume and timing of them created a pattern that refused to dissolve into coincidence no matter how long he stared at the darkened screen trying to will it back into something innocent. When he finally rose from the couch, his legs felt unsteady beneath him, the burning in his feet that had become a constant background companion over the past months now flaring into sharper stabs with each step across the cool floorboards toward the staircase, and as he climbed slowly to the bedroom he paused halfway up, gripping the banister tightly while listening to the soft, even sound of Caitlin's breathing coming from behind the half-open door, a sound that had once brought him comfort on nights when his own insomnia kept him awake, but that tonight felt strangely separate from the woman lying there, as though the person sleeping in their bed and the person who had filed those insurance claims existed in parallel realities that had only just begun to overlap in his awareness with consequences he could not yet fully comprehend. He slipped into bed beside her without turning on the light, moving carefully so as not to wake her, and when she stirred slightly and reached out in her sleep to rest her hand on his chest, he lay very still, feeling the warmth of her palm through his t-shirt while his mind continued to replay fragments of memory that now carried new and disturbing weight. The way she had winced when turning her head too quickly last month and blamed it on a stiff neck from an awkward sleeping position. The faint yellowish discoloration under her left eye that she had covered with concealer and attributed to seasonal allergies flaring up again. The nights when she had woken suddenly with a sharp intake of breath and then laughed softly when he asked if she was all right, murmuring something about a bad dream before curling closer against him as though seeking protection from whatever had startled her awake. Each recollection now refracted through the lens of those X-ray fracture lines and their insurance payouts, transforming what had seemed like minor, unrelated incidents into pieces of a larger picture whose edges he could only glimpse but whose shape already frightened him more than he was willing to admit even to himself. Sleep did not come easily that night. Instead he lay staring at the ceiling where the streetlight outside painted shifting patterns across the plaster, patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of the branching fracture lines he had seen on Dr. Mendez's monitor earlier that day. And every time he closed his eyes the images returned, the clean breaks in the zygomatic arches, the remodeled orbital floor, the fresh mandibular crack that could be no more than 4 to 6 months old, each one accompanied by Caitlin's voice explaining yet another fall, another bump, Another moment of clumsiness that had seemed endearing in its human imperfection but now felt rehearsed, calculated, part of a performance whose purpose he could not yet name but whose existence he could no longer deny. Morning arrived grey and damp, the kind of October dawn in Portland where the sky seems to press down directly onto the rooftops and the river carries a heavier scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. And when Caitlin rose at her usual time to prepare the smoothie, Michael heard the familiar whir of the blender from downstairs at precisely 7:05. The sound that had once signaled care and routine now carrying an undercurrent of something more ambiguous that made his stomach tighten as he lay in bed listening to her movements in the kitchen, the clink of the glass being set on the counter, the soft thud of the blender jar returning to its base, the faint rustle of her slippers crossing the floor toward the staircase, and when she appeared in the bedroom doorway holding the green drink with its usual hopeful smile, he accepted it from her hand without comment, drank it slowly while she watched with that quiet satisfaction he had once found touching, and although the metallic aftertaste seemed even more pronounced this morning, he forced himself to finish every drop because any refusal at this moment would have cracked open the fragile truce they had maintained since leaving the dental clinic the day before. They spoke little during breakfast. Caitlin mentioned errands she needed to run later, picking up dry cleaning, stopping by the post office, perhaps visiting the health food store to replenish the spirulina and maca she had been adding to his smoothies, and Michael nodded along, murmuring agreements while his mind continued to circle the same questions that had kept him awake. How many of her injuries had truly been accidents? How many had been staged for the insurance money he had just discovered? And, the thought that caused the deepest chill, whether any of them had been deliberately self-inflicted in order to collect payouts while she simultaneously managed his own declining health with daily doses of the very mixture whose taste now lingered unpleasantly on his tongue long after the glass was empty. After she left the house around 10 o'clock, kissing him goodbye with the same warmth she always showed, Michael remained at the kitchen table for a long time staring at the empty smoothie glass she had rinsed and placed in the drying rack, noticing for the first time how thoroughly she always cleaned it immediately after he finished drinking, as though removing any trace of residue before it could be examined or questioned. And when he finally rose to carry the glass to the sink himself, he turned it slowly in his hands under the bright overhead light, looking for any faint film or unusual sediment that might explain the persistent metallic flavor, though he found nothing visible beyond the normal sheen of water droplets clinging to the interior surface. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of distraction. He tried to work from home on the bridge retrofit drawings that were already behind schedule because of his worsening concentration and the frequent pauses he needed to rub his burning feet against the carpet in an attempt to dull the sensation. But every few minutes his attention drifted back to the laptop still sitting on the coffee table where he had left it the night before, and eventually the pull became too strong to resist, so he opened it again, this time searching more deliberately for information about thallium poisoning after remembering a half-forgotten article he had read years earlier about the heavy metal's ability to mimic neurological conditions while causing hair loss, peripheral neuropathy, and gastrointestinal distress, symptoms that now aligned disturbingly well with everything he had been experiencing since the smoothies became a daily ritual. The search results were chilling in their precision. Thallium, once used in rat poison and still available in certain industrial applications, produces a classic triad of alopecia, painful ascending neuropathy beginning in the feet and hands, and gastrointestinal symptoms that can be mistaken for chronic illness or aging. And because it is nearly tasteless in low doses and clears the body slowly over weeks to months, it is notoriously difficult to detect unless specifically tested for in hair or urine samples taken at the right time interval after exposure ceases. Michael read page after page with growing nausea, not only from the physical recognition of his own symptoms but from the dawning realization that if Caitlin had been adding even trace amounts of such a substance to his morning drink over an extended period, the effects would accumulate gradually enough to appear natural, especially in a 52-year-old man already under stress and already diagnosed with early neuropathy by a doctor who had never thought to order heavy metal screening, because no one had suggested foul play until the dental x-rays forced the first crack in the facade. By early afternoon the house felt too quiet, too full of echoes, the creak of floorboards settling, the distant rush of the river, the occasional drip from the kitchen faucet that Caitlin always meant to have fixed but never quite got around to calling a plumber about, and Michael found himself wandering from room to room without purpose, pausing in the doorway of her home office where the door stood slightly ajar as though inviting inspection while simultaneously warning against it, the room, organized with the same meticulous efficiency she brought to everything else, labeled file folders in neat rows on the bookshelf, a small safe tucked beneath the desk that she had once explained contained important documents from her previous marriage and her Dallas years, a calendar on the wall marked with color-coded reminders for insurance renewals, doctor appointments, both his and hers, and occasional weekend getaways they had planned but never quite managed to take because his energy levels kept dropping at the last minute. He stepped inside despite the prickle of guilt that accompanied the action, guilt for doubting her, guilt for invading her private space after she had taken over so much of his own life with apparent generosity, and sat at her desk for several long minutes simply looking at the objects arranged there, the framed photo of the two of them taken during their first hike together along the Columbia Gorge, both smiling against a backdrop of waterfalls and evergreen trees. The small jade plant she had propagated from a cutting she brought from her old apartment, the stack of unopened envelopes from insurance companies whose logos he now recognized from his late-night search, envelopes she had collected from the mailbox and carried here without ever mentioning their contents to him. One envelope lay slightly askew on top of the stack, its flap not fully sealed as though opened and resealed hastily, and after another long hesitation Michael slid his finger beneath the edge and lifted it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper that turned out to be a claim status update letter dated just 3 weeks earlier confirming receipt of documentation for accidental injury benefit, related to a rib fracture and promising processing within 30 business days with an expected payout of $68,400 pending final review of medical records. The letterhead matched one of the companies from his online search, and the policy number listed at the top corresponded to a personal accident policy in Caitlin's name alone, a policy he had never been told existed and whose premiums had never appeared in their joint financial statements that she now handled so competently on his behalf. He replaced the letter exactly as he had found it, closed the envelope with trembling fingers, and left the office exactly as he had entered it, closing the door softly behind him before returning downstairs to sit on the couch where the laptop still waited like an accusation he could no longer ignore. And although part of him wanted desperately to confront Caitlin the moment she walked through the door with grocery bags and a cheerful explanation for whatever errands had taken longer than expected. Another part, the part that had spent 3 years trusting her care, drinking her smoothies, letting her manage his medications and appointments and finances, understood that any direct accusation at this stage would likely result in tears, defensiveness, gaslighting, or some combination of all three that would leave him more confused and more isolated than before. So he waited. When Caitlin returned around 4:30 carrying 2 canvas totes filled with produce, supplements, and the dry cleaning she had mentioned that morning, she greeted him with her usual brightness, kissing his cheek while setting the bags on the kitchen counter and immediately beginning to unpack while chatting about the new brand of Lion's Mane capsules the health food store had just stocked and how the clerk had recommended combining them with the reishi she already used because they work synergistically for nerve support and cognitive clarity, exactly what you need right now. Michael listened from the doorway, nodding at appropriate intervals while watching her move through the familiar routine with effortless grace, noticing for the first time how carefully she measured out the evening dose of supplements she planned to add to his tea later, how she rinsed the measuring spoon immediately after using it, how she glanced at him occasionally with what looked like genuine concern mixed with something else he could not quite name, calculation perhaps, or vigilance. And although he managed to keep his voice steady when he asked about her day, he felt the distance between them widening with every ordinary sentence exchanged across the kitchen island. Dinner that night was subdued. Caitlin prepared a simple vegetable stir-fry with ginger and tamari, the same dish she had made countless times before, and they ate at the small table by the window overlooking the river where the water now reflected the first lights coming on along the opposite bank, conversation staying carefully neutral, work updates, weather forecasts, a funny story about the woman ahead of her in line at the health food store who had bought 17 jars of the same supplement, and although Caitlin laughed at her own telling of the anecdote, Michael found himself unable to join in fully because every time she smiled or reached across the table to touch his hand he saw the x-ray fractures superimposed over her features, saw the insurance letters filed neatly in her office drawer, saw the green smoothie glass from that morning still sitting clean and empty in the drying rack as though nothing unusual had ever touched its interior. After dinner they moved to the living room couch as usual, Caitlin curling against his side with her head on his shoulder while some nature documentary about deep-sea ecosystems played quietly on the television. But Michael could not focus on the screen because his mind kept returning to the same loop of questions. How long had the pattern been in place before he noticed? Whether any of her previous husbands or partners had experienced similar unexplained health declines. Whether the double-layered insurance policies he had glimpsed in the public records included anything on his own life that he had never been shown. And the thought that caused the deepest physical chill. Whether continuing to drink the smoothies tomorrow morning would represent surrender to whatever was happening, or whether refusing them outright would force a confrontation he was not yet prepared to survive emotionally or physically given how weak and foggy his thinking had become. He did not sleep well again that night. Caitlin drifted off quickly beside him, but Michael lay awake listening to the river and to her steady breathing while fragments of memory replayed themselves in endless variation. The first time she handed him a smoothie and watched him drink it with that quiet pride. The way she had taken over the finances so he wouldn't have to worry. The late-night phone calls behind closed doors, the locked cabinets, the unopened insurance mail, the fractures on the x-ray, the metallic taste that never quite left his mouth anymore no matter how much water he drank afterward, each piece fitting more tightly into a mosaic whose overall shape he feared more with every hour that passed without answers. The following morning unfolded with eerie similarity to every previous morning. The blender at 7:05, the green liquid handed to him with a kiss on the cheek, the hopeful smile as Caitlin watched him swallow the first sip and then the rest. And although he considered pouring it down the sink, the moment her back was turned, he could not bring himself to do it because the act would have felt like an irrevocable declaration of war against the woman who still claimed to love him and care for him. Above all else, so he drank it slowly while she prepared her own breakfast, feeling the familiar chalky texture coat his tongue and wondering how many more mornings he could continue this ritual before the cumulative effects made the decision for him. Days blurred into one another after that. Caitlin's attentiveness increased. She began keeping a symptom journal on her phone, noting the intensity of the burning in his feet each evening, the frequency of his memory lapses during conversations, the number of hairs he left in the shower drain each morning, and she used the data to adjust the smoothie ingredients almost daily. More alpha-lipoic acid 1 week because it's supposed to help with neuropathic pain. Extra B-complex the next because your levels might be dropping again. And although she presented every change as an act of love, Michael began to feel like a subject in an ongoing experiment whose parameters only she understood fully. He stopped jogging with her because the burning in his feet made even short distances excruciating, and although Caitlin expressed disappointment, she quickly adapted by going alone and returning flushed and energized, bringing back stories of the trail conditions or birds she had seen along the river that she recounted with such enthusiasm it almost masked the growing physical distance between them during the hour she was gone. He began avoiding mirrors because the thinning hair and hollows under his eyes had become too noticeable even to himself, and when Caitlin commented gently that he looked tired lately, he agreed without argument because denying it would have required energy he no longer possessed. He stopped answering most calls from friends and colleagues because conversations demanded concentration he found increasingly difficult to sustain, and when Sophia texted to check in, he replied with short assurances that everything was fine, just busy, even though the words felt hollow even as he typed them. He began locking his own office door when he worked from home, not because he had anything to hide, but because the act of turning the key gave him a small illusion of control in a life that felt increasingly managed by someone else's schedule, someone else's supplements, someone else's explanations. And through it all, Caitlin remained the picture of devoted care. Fresh tea waiting when he came downstairs, blankets adjusted when he shivered despite the thermostat reading 72 degrees, hands massaging his feet when the burning became unbearable, voice soft and reassuring when he confessed how frightened he felt by his own body's betrayal, and yet every gesture of kindness now carried a shadow. Every act of attention now felt like surveillance. Every smoothie now tasted like evidence. He could neither prove nor ignore. One afternoon, while Caitlin was out running errands, Michael returned to her office, this time with more deliberate intent, and after several minutes of careful searching through unlocked drawers, he found a small notebook tucked behind a row of file folders, a plain black moleskin with no label on the cover, and when he opened it, he discovered page after page of dated entries written in Caitlin's neat handwriting, records of smoothie ingredients and quantities, notes on his reported symptoms. Each day, burning 7/10, hair loss moderate, memory lapses x3, reminders to reorder specific powders from online suppliers, and, most disturbingly, occasional marginal comments such as increase dose by 0.2 milligrams next week if no escalation, or monitor for gastrointestinal response after adjustment. Written in the same careful script but with a clinical detachment that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up despite the warmth of the room. He photographed several pages with his phone using the flash off to avoid any telltale reflection, replaced the notebook exactly as he had found it, closed the drawer quietly, and left the office before Caitlin returned. His heart pounding so violently he could feel it in his throat while he sat on the couch pretending to read when she walked through the door 20 minutes later carrying bags from the health food store and smiling as though nothing in the world had changed. That night he did not drink the smoothie. When Caitlin handed him the glass at 7:05 he accepted it, carried it to the sink under the pretense of rinsing it first, and while her back was turned pouring hot water for tea he poured the green liquid down the drain, running the faucet long enough to wash away every trace before setting the empty glass in the drying rack and returning to the table where she waited expectantly. "I'm not very hungry tonight," he said quietly, meeting her eyes for the first time that day without looking away. "My stomach's been off since yesterday. I think I'll skip it." Caitlin's smile faltered for only a fraction of a second, so brief he might have imagined it, before she recovered and nodded with immediate concern. "Of course, honey. Whatever feels right. Do you want some ginger tea instead? It might settle things." He accepted the tea, drank it slowly while watching her clear the kitchen with the same efficient grace she always showed, and when she kissed him goodnight later and curled against him in bed, he lay awake once more listening to the river and to her breathing, feeling the first faint clearing in his head that had been missing for months, not dramatic, not miraculous, but enough to sharpen the edges of his thoughts and make the decision he had been avoiding finally unavoidable. The next morning he poured the smoothie down the drain again while she showered, and the morning after that the same, and each time he felt a small measure of clarity return, not enough to reverse the damage already done, but enough to strengthen his resolve to seek answers outside the house whose walls now felt more confining with every passing day. Sophia's insistence echoed in Michael's mind like a lifeline thrown from across the miles that separated Portland from Seattle, her voice on the phone the previous evening carrying the same mix of worry and determination that had marked every conversation since she first met Caitlin 3 years earlier and warned him that things were moving too fast for comfort. And now as he lay awake in the darkened bedroom listening to the river's persistent murmur outside and to Caitlin's steady breathing. Beside him, he finally decided to heed her advice in full, starting with the simple but revolutionary act of no longer consuming the smoothies that had become the unquestioned centerpiece of his mornings, even as his health continued to decline in ways that no doctor had yet fully explained. The next day began with the familiar whir of the blender at 7:05, the sound filtering up from the kitchen where Caitlin prepared the green mixture with her usual efficiency, and when she brought it upstairs to the bedroom with a smile that seemed genuine in its concern for his well-being, he accepted the glass as always, holding it in his hands while she chatted about the weather forecast calling for rain later in the afternoon and how she had added extra alpha-lipoic acid this time because it was supposed to help with the nerve pain he had mentioned the night before. But once she turned to head back downstairs, he waited until her footsteps faded and then slipped quietly into the bathroom where he poured the contents down the toilet, flushing twice to ensure no trace remained before rinsing the glass thoroughly under the faucet and placing it in the drying rack as though he had finished every drop just like all the previous mornings. The clarity that had begun to emerge the night before grew slightly stronger throughout the day, not in a dramatic rush but in subtle increments that made his thoughts feel less foggy and more connected than they had in months, allowing him to focus for longer periods on the bridge retrofit drawings at his home office desk where the computer screen no longer blurred after only 20 minutes of staring and the burning in his feet. While still present, seemed marginally less intense as though his body was beginning to expel whatever had been building up inside it over the extended period of daily consumption. Caitlin noticed nothing unusual when she returned from her errands that afternoon carrying bags of fresh produce and new supplement bottles from the health food store, greeting him with a kiss on the cheek and immediately beginning to unpack while asking how his day had been and whether the smoothie had helped with his energy levels as she had hoped. And Michael responded with a non-committal nod and a murmured assurance that he felt a bit better than yesterday, watching her movements closely for any sign that she suspected the deception but finding only the same attentive care she had always shown, the care that had once felt like love but now carried an undercurrent of something more calculated as he recalled the notebook entries he had photographed in her office with their clinical notes on doses and symptom progression. That evening Sophia called again, her voice tense but resolute when he answered after the second ring, and although he had planned to keep the details vague to avoid alarming her unnecessarily, he found himself recounting everything in a rush of words that poured out once he started. The dental x-ray revelations, the fracture patterns that suggested repeated trauma, the insurance claim records he had discovered online, the notebook with its meticulous logs of his symptoms and adjustments to their smoothie ingredients, the metallic taste that now seemed suspiciously linked to the thallium poisoning descriptions he had read. And Sophia listened without interrupting until he finished, her silence on the line heavy with the weight of what he had just shared before she finally spoke in a voice that combined sisterly protectiveness with the sharp focus of someone who had always been the more skeptical of the two when it came to Caitlin's sudden entry into their lives. "Dad, this isn't right. None of it is right. And you need to get tested for toxins immediately, not with Dr. Patel who she's been going to with you but with someone new, someone she doesn't know about. Because if she's been putting something in those smoothies to make you sick while she collects insurance money from her own accidents, we can't risk her finding out you're onto her before we have proof," she said firmly, her words coming in a steady stream that left no room for doubt or delay. "I'll find a toxicologist in Portland or even Seattle if needed. There's a lab here at the university that does heavy metal screening for environmental studies. And you need to stop drinking anything she gives you right now, pour it out when she's not looking, eat only sealed food you buy yourself, and document everything from here on out because if this is what I think it is we are going to need evidence for the police." Michael agreed, the clarity in his head sharpening further with each sentence she spoke as though her conviction was lending him strength he had lost along the way, and by the end of the call they had a plan. He would drive to a walk-in lab in a neighboring suburb the next day under the pretense of running errands for work, request a comprehensive toxicology panel including heavy metals like thallium based on the symptoms he described, pay out of pocket to avoid any insurance alerts that might tip Caitlin off, and send the results directly to Sophia once they came in so she could help interpret them away from Caitlin's influence. The following morning he poured the smoothie down the drain again while Caitlin was in the shower, the green liquid swirling away with a gurgle that felt like a small victory even as his hands shook from the deception, and when she emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a towel he told her casually that he had a client meeting across town that might run long so not to worry if he was late for dinner, kissing her goodbye with a forced smile that he hoped looked natural before driving not to any meeting but to the discreet medical lab in Beaverton where the receptionist asked no questions beyond the basics, and the phlebotomist drew several vials of blood and a hair sample with efficient professionalism that made the process feel almost routine despite the pounding of his heart throughout the entire visit. Waiting for the results felt like an eternity compressed into the next 3 days, during which Caitlin's attentiveness bordered on suffocating as she prepared special teas and massaged his feet in the evenings while asking detailed questions about his symptoms that now seemed less like care and more like monitoring, her notebook likely updated in secret after he went to bed, and Michael found himself avoiding her touch for the first time, claiming headaches or fatigue to retreat to the guest room where he slept fitfully, listening for any sound of her moving through the house at night as though expecting her to check on him or worse. When the lab results arrived via encrypted email on the 4th day, he opened them alone in his locked office while Caitlin was out jogging, his hand steady enough now to click the attachment without trembling, and the report confirmed what he had feared in stark clinical language: elevated levels of thallium in both blood and hair samples consistent with chronic low-dose exposure over several months, with concentrations high enough to cause the neuropathy, hair loss, and cognitive fog he had been experiencing, but not yet lethal if discontinued immediately, though long-term damage to nerves and organs could be permanent without prompt chelation therapy to remove the metal from his system. The revelation hit him like a physical force, knocking the breath from his lungs as he reread the report 3 times to be sure he had not misunderstood. And in that moment, the fragments of doubt that had been accumulating since the dental visit coalesced into a coherent horror. Caitlin had been poisoning him deliberately, methodically, using the smoothies as a delivery method for a substance that mimicked natural decline so perfectly that no one, not Dr. Patel, not his friends, not even himself, had questioned the narrative of stress and aging until the X-rays exposed the first thread to pull. He called Sophia immediately, his voice low and urgent as he read the key sections aloud over the phone, and she responded with a mix of rage and relief that mirrored his own inner turmoil, telling him to forward the report to her right away so she could consult with a toxicology expert at her university who specialized in environmental poisons and could advise on next steps, including contacting law enforcement without alerting Caitlin prematurely. The police involvement began that afternoon after Sophia connected him with Detective Elena Vasquez from the Portland Police Bureau's Special Victims Unit, a woman in her mid-40s with a calm, authoritative voice that cut through the panic building in his chest as he explained everything from the dental x-rays to the insurance records to the notebook logs to the toxicology results. And although he spoke from the locked office with the door closed and the river's noise masking any sound that might carry, she listened patiently, asking clarifying questions about timelines, access to household items, and any unusual purchases Caitlin might have made that could explain the source of the thallium, promising to open an investigation discreetly and advising him to act normal at home while avoiding all food or drink prepared by her until they could arrange a safe extraction. The new unexpected twist emerged during the initial police inquiry the following day when Detective Vasquez called back with preliminary findings from a background check on Caitlin. Her accidents were not isolated to their time together but extended back through her previous relationships in Dallas and other states, with similar patterns of personal injury claims filed under different policies that had netted her hundreds of thousands over the years, some partially self-inflicted as suggested by the X-ray patterns but others staged with assistance from a known associate named Ryan Clark, her sister's ex-boyfriend who had a history of minor fraud convictions and had been spotted in Portland several times over the past year, coinciding with Caitlin's more severe injuries that required medical documentation for larger payouts. Detective Vasquez explained that Ryan's involvement added a layer of conspiracy to the scheme, making it not just a solo operation but a coordinated effort where he helped fabricate the trauma, perhaps by administering controlled blows or staging falls in ways that produced verifiable fractures without immediate life-threatening risk, and split the insurance proceeds in exchange for his silence and assistance. And although the evidence was circumstantial at this stage, it aligned with anonymous tips the Bureau had received from Dallas about similar patterns in Caitlin's past marriages, where partners had reported unexplained health declines before she moved on with substantial settlements. The most shocking twist came later that evening when Detective Vasquez emailed a secure link to scan documents uncovered from an insurance database search. Caitlin had not only forged a $1.5 million life insurance policy on Michael's life, naming herself as sole beneficiary using digital manipulation of his signature from the marriage certificate and joint tax filings, but she had also secretly taken out a $2.5 million policy on her own life with Michael listed as the beneficiary in a double-layered plan that ensured she profited regardless of how events unfolded. If he died naturally from the accumulating thallium, she collected his policy while appearing the grieving widow. If he grew suspicious enough to divorce or confront her, she could fake her own death with Ryan's help, disappear with staged evidence pointing to foul play on Michael's part, and leave him facing murder investigations while she accessed the payout through offshore accounts under an alias she had already established from previous schemes. Michael's hidden strength revealed itself in those moments of revelation as he sat alone in the guest room reading the documents on his phone while Caitlin prepared dinner downstairs, the clarity returning to his mind, allowing him to connect dots he had been too foggy to see before: the late-night calls, the locked cabinets, the unopened mail, and transforming him from a weakened victim dependent on her care into someone who could finally investigate and resist the manipulation that had nearly destroyed him, drawing on the stubborn resilience that had carried him through Laura's illness and death years earlier, and on the unwavering support of Sophia, who texted him constantly with encouragement and updates from her own research into thallium antidotes and legal protections for poisoning victims. As the police built their case over the next several days with discreet surveillance of Ryan Clark's movements in Portland and subpoenas for Caitlin's financial records that revealed wire transfers to accounts linked to him after each major accident, Michael continued the charade at home by pouring out every smoothie, tea, or meal she prepared when she wasn't looking, eating only sealed snacks he bought secretly during errands, and storing them in his locked office, his body responding with gradual improvements, less burning in his extremities, fewer memory lapses, strands of hair no longer falling out in handfuls, that fueled his determination to see the plan through without alerting her, even as the emotional toll of living with someone who had been slowly killing him for profit weighed heavier with each deceptive goodnight kiss and each forced smile over dinner. The investigation deepened when Detective Vasquez shared that Ryan Clark had been arrested on unrelated warrants in a neighboring county and had begun cooperating in exchange for reduced charges, providing emails and texts with Caitlin detailing the thallium dosing schedule adjusted based on Michael's symptom progression to avoid detection while ensuring a natural decline over 6 to 9 months, and describing the staged injuries where Ryan had used padded tools to create fractures without excessive bruising, splitting the insurance money 60/40ths in Caitlin's favor, while she handled the paperwork and medical visits to legitimize the claims. Michael's resolve hardened further as he learned from Sophia's toxicology contact that chelation therapy could begin discreetly at a clinic outside town once the police coordinated a safe exit from the house, and in the meantime he documented every interaction with Caitlin, photos of the smoothies before dumping them, notes on her questions about his health, recordings of conversations where she suggested increasing certain supplements, building a portfolio of evidence that transformed his hidden strength from mere survival into active resistance against the predator who had disguised herself as his partner for 3 years. The days that followed the confirmation of thallium in his system unfolded with a strange duality of outward calm and inner turbulence, as Michael moved through the familiar rooms of the house by the river with the deliberate caution of someone who had suddenly realized that every surface, every routine, every gesture from the woman he once loved might conceal intent rather than affection. And although the physical improvements continued to accumulate slowly, the burning in his feet receding. From constant fire to intermittent warmth, the fog in his thoughts lifting enough that he could read blueprints for more than 30 minutes without losing focus, the strands of hair in the shower drain becoming noticeably fewer, each small gain felt like stolen territory reclaimed from an enemy who still occupied the same space, still prepared the same meals, still asked the same concerned questions with a voice that now sounded to him like a carefully rehearsed performance rather than genuine care. Every morning the ritual repeated itself with mechanical precision. Caitlin descended to the kitchen at precisely 7:03, the blender started its low whine at 7:05, the green mixture swirled in the glass she handed him at 7:07 with her usual hopeful smile and the same soft encouragement. "Drink up, honey, this batch has extra lion's mane to help with that memory fog you mentioned." And Michael accepted the glass with a nod and a murmured thank you, carried it upstairs or into the bathroom under. The pretext of finishing it while getting ready, waited until her footsteps retreated back down the hallway, then poured the contents into the sink or toilet, running the water long enough to mask the gurgle and rinsing the glass thoroughly before placing it in the drying rack so that when she later glanced at it everything appeared normal, the glass empty and clean as though he had consumed every drop without hesitation or suspicion. He photographed each smoothie before disposal, holding the glass up to the bathroom light to capture the exact shade of green, the tiny bubbles clinging to the sides, the faint residue that sometimes clung to the rim despite her careful blending, and saved the images in a hidden folder on his phone protected by a passcode she had never asked for and would never guess. Each photo timestamped and labeled with notes like October 21st, 7:08 a.m., color darker than yesterday, metallic odor stronger, building a visual timeline that would later corroborate his claim that he had stopped ingesting the mixture and that his symptoms improved only after discontinuation. He kept a separate encrypted log in a note-taking app disguised as a simple grocery list, where he recorded not just the dumping but every detail of her behavior in those moments, the way her eyes lingered on the glass when he returned it empty, the slight tightening of her jaw when he reported feeling a little better today, the quick pivot to suggesting a higher dose of whatever supplement she had most recently purchased, the faint sigh she let escape when he declined, disguised as concern, but now recognizable to him as frustration at the slowing progress of whatever plan she had set in motion months earlier. Conversations became minefields he navigated with careful neutrality, recording them whenever possible by keeping his phone in his shirt pocket on voice memo mode during evenings on the couch or dinners at the small table by the river window, with the sound of water against the bank-provided cover for the tiny red light blinking on the screen. And later he listened back in the guest room after she had fallen asleep, earbuds in, volume low, transcribing the most telling exchanges. "You're looking so much clearer lately, it's wonderful, but let's not get complacent. I think another week of the full dose will really lock in the gains," followed by his noncommittal maybe. "We'll see," and her immediate follow-up, "I ordered more of the reishi blend. It arrived today, perfect timing." He began noticing patterns in her questions that he had previously dismissed as simple concern. She always asked about the burning in his feet first, then the hair loss, then the memory lapses, as though ticking off a mental checklist of expected symptoms, and when he reported improvement in any category her tone shifted subtly, a slight rise in pitch, a quicker change of subject, a suggestion that perhaps he was underestimating how much better the supplements are making you feel, and each such moment went into the log with timestamps and descriptions of her body language. October the 23rd, 2041. When I said feet feel 40% better, she paused 1.2 seconds before smiling, fingers clenched briefly on the throw pillow. He started buying sealed food items during brief errands he invented. Protein bars from a gas station, bottled water from a convenience store, apples and plastic bags from a farmer's market stall, and stored them in the locked bottom drawer of his office desk beneath old project folders, eating only those when she wasn't watching. And although the diet was monotonous and unsatisfying, it provided a baseline certainty that nothing he consumed had been tampered with, and each meal eaten in solitude behind a locked door felt like a quiet act of reclamation, a refusal to let her control even the most basic function of nourishment. He observed how Caitlin's behavior shifted in response to his gradual recovery, at first subtle surprise when he walked without wincing, then increasing anxiety masked as over-solicitous care, extra blankets when he didn't ask for them, insistence on driving him everywhere because you still look tired, repeated offers to make special teas that he declined with polite excuses about stomach sensitivity, and when he reported sleeping better or remembering details from work meetings more clearly, her smile became tighter, her questions more insistent. Are you sure you're not just imagining the improvement? Sometimes the mind plays tricks when we want to feel better. He documented these exchanges meticulously, using the voice recorder during walks along the river path when she suggested fresh air might help, positioning the phone in his jacket pocket to capture her words as they strolled beneath cottonwoods shedding their last leaves. You know, the doctor said thallium exposure can cause permanent nerve damage if not treated early. Wait, I mean, heavy metal toxicity in general, not that you have that. Of course. And he would respond calmly, interesting. I'll mention it at my next checkup, while inwardly noting the slip, the quick correction, the way her pace quickened slightly afterward as though she realized she had said too much. He began cross-referencing her accidents with the dates on the insurance claims he had photographed. The rib fracture in July that required ER visit and 6 weeks of rest coincided exactly with a $68,400 payout confirmation letter he had seen in her office. The wrist sprain in October aligned with a $42,750 claim. The ankle twist during their jog last summer matched a smaller $18,200 payout from a different policy, and he saved screenshots of these correlations in his evidence folder. Alongside the X-ray images Dr. Mendez had emailed him at Sophia's request, building a chronological timeline that showed her injuries generating money at the same time his health declined under her care. He started leaving the house more often under pretexts of work meetings or supply runs, each time stopping at different locations to buy food or simply to breathe air that wasn't filtered through the same rooms where she had poisoned him for months. And during these absences he checked in with Detective Vasquez via encrypted text, receiving updates that the investigation had expanded. Bank records confirmed regular transfers from Caitlin's personal account to one linked to Ryan Clark after each major claim. Phone records showed frequent calls between them on dates matching her injuries, and a search warrant for Clark's apartment had uncovered small quantities of thallium sulfate powder hidden in a locked toolbox along with notes on dosing schedules that matched the entries in Caitlin's notebook. He learned from Sophia that the toxicology expert had reviewed his lab results and confirmed the exposure pattern was consistent with chronic low-dose administration over at least 8 months, likely mixed into food or drink to avoid detection, and that chelation could begin as soon as he was safely out of the house, with DMSA tablets taken orally for the first phase to avoid the need for 4 sessions that might require explanation to Caitlin. He rehearsed the moment of confrontation in his mind during sleepless nights, imagining the police at the door, Caitlin's face shifting from surprise to calculation to denial, and practiced the words he would say. I know about the thallium. I know about the insurance. I know about Ryan. The police have everything. It's over. Keeping his voice steady, his posture calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break or rage. He felt the hidden strength that had once been only the instinct to survive now solidify into something sharper and more deliberate. The ability to observe without reacting, to document without alerting, to wait without weakening, and each day he spent in the house became a test of endurance, a silent battle of wills where he refused to let her see the clarity returning to his eyes, refused to let her hear the tremor of anger in his voice, refused to let her win by breaking him before the law could reach her. He began leaving subtle markers around the house, a book left open to a page about heavy metal poisoning on the coffee table, a printed article about thallium tucked into a magazine she often read, not to confront her directly but to watch her reaction when she found them, noting how quickly she removed them, how her questions about his reading material became more frequent, how her smiles grew thinner when he mentioned researching health topics online. He continued to record everything. The night she suggested one last big dose of everything to really push through the last of the symptoms. The morning she asked why the supplement bottles seemed to last longer than expected. The afternoon she lingered outside his office door longer than usual after he locked it. The evening she pressed him about whether he had noticed anything strange about the smoothies lately. And through it all the river kept flowing past the house, steady and indifferent, carrying away the leaves that fell from the cottonwoods and the last traces of the poison he no longer ingested, while Michael waited for the moment when the evidence he had gathered would be enough, when the police would move, when he could finally step out of the trap he had lived in for 3 years and into the light of truth that had been denied him for so long. The waiting stretched across the final weeks of October into early November with a tension that settled into his bones like the damp cold that crept in through the windows each evening as the days shortened and the river reflected the grey sky in flat, unyielding silver. And although Michael continued the daily ritual of dumping the smoothie the moment Caitlin's back was turned, pouring the green liquid down the sink with the faucet running to mask the gurgle, rinsing the glass until it shone innocently clean, placing it back in the drying rack so that when she glanced at it later everything appeared as it always had, the act no longer felt like mere survival but like the deliberate construction of a bridge toward the moment when he could walk away from the house without looking back, each emptied glass a small brick in the structure that would carry him to safety. He maintained the facade with meticulous care, responding to Caitlin's morning smiles with nods and quiet thanks, eating the breakfast she prepared by pushing food around his plate while claiming a lingering lack of appetite that she accepted with concerned frowns and offers of more supplements, retreating to his office for work where he could lock the door and breathe freely for a few hours, documenting every detail of her behavior in the encrypted log that now spanned hundreds of entries. The way she asked about his energy levels with a note of hope that sounded increasingly forced. The slight hesitation before she measured out the next dose of whatever new powder she had ordered online, the quick glances at the empty smoothie glass when he returned it to the kitchen, the faint tightening of her lips when he reported sleeping better or remembering details from meetings more clearly than he had in months. The physical improvements continued to accumulate in small, undeniable ways that he tracked privately in a separate journal hidden beneath the floorboard in the guest room closet, the burning in his feet receding from constant fire to intermittent warmth that flared only on particularly cold mornings, the hair loss halting completely so that new growth began to appear in soft patches along his temples and crown, the memory lapses becoming less frequent until he could complete complex calculations on bridge load-bearing capacities without losing his train of thought midway through a formula, and each gain felt like stolen ground reclaimed from an enemy who still walked the same halls, still prepared the same meals, still asked the same questions with a voice that now carried the faint strain of someone beginning to sense that the plan was slipping. Sophia's daily encrypted messages provided the external rhythm he needed to keep moving forward, her updates arriving like clockwork each afternoon. Detective Vasquez says the financial subpoenas came back positive, transfers to Ryan Clark match every major injury date, or the search warrant for the apartment is ready. They're waiting for one more lab confirmation on the thallium sample from your hair. I've spoken with the clinic again. They can start chelation the day after the arrest if you're ready, her words serving as both anchor and compass, reminding him that the isolation he had endured was nearing its end and that the family bond which Caitlin had tried to sever was stronger than ever. Detective Vasquez called once a week for brief check-ins, her voice calm and professional over the secure line as she outlined the progress. Ryan Clark had begun cooperating fully after his arrest on unrelated warrants in a neighboring county, providing emails and text messages that detailed the thallium sourcing from an industrial supplier under a fake business name. The dosing schedule adjusted based on Michael's reported symptoms to avoid sudden death that might trigger autopsy. The split of insurance proceeds after each stage fracture, and the contingency plan to fake Caitlin's death if Michael grew suspicious enough to divorce or confront her, leaving him facing murder charges while she disappeared with the $2.5 million policy payout through offshore accounts already established under an alias. The evidence portfolio Michael had built grew thicker with each passing day, photographs of every dump smoothie timestamped and annotated, audio recordings of conversations where Caitlin slipped and mentioned thallium before correcting herself, notes on her reactions when he reported improvements, scans of insurance letters from her office drawer, screenshots of public claim records linking her injuries to payouts, and he backed everything up to an encrypted drive that Sophia controlled, sending daily updates so that even if something happened to him before the police moved, the truth would not die with him. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning in early November when the knock at the door interrupted breakfast just as Caitlin was handing him the smoothie with her usual drink up. "Honey, today's batch has extra maca for stamina." And Michael set the glass on the counter untouched as he walked to answer it, opening the door to Detective Vasquez and 4 officers who entered with the warrant already in hand, announcing the charges in a clear voice that echoed through the hallway while Caitlin stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the blender still humming softly behind her as though the routine could somehow continue despite the uniforms and badges filling the space. The moment unfolded with a surreal clarity that Michael had rehearsed in his mind so many times it almost felt scripted. Caitlin's face draining of color as the officers read her rights, her protests rising in pitch. "This is insane. There's been a mistake. I haven't done anything." The handcuffs clicking around her wrists as she looked at Michael with eyes that held not remorse but a cold calculation as though assessing whether denial or confession would serve her better. the search team moving through the house with methodical efficiency, opening drawers, photographing the supplement bottles, seizing the notebook from her office, collecting the blender and remaining powders for lab analysis, and Michael standing aside as instructed, watching it all with a numbness that gave way to quiet relief when the patrol car pulled away with Caitlin in the backseat, her gaze meeting his through the window for one final moment before the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared down Riverbend Lane. Detective Vasquez remained behind to coordinate the search and explain the next steps. Ryan Clark had already been taken into custody that morning in a simultaneous raid, his apartment yielding physical evidence of thallium sulfate containers, padded tools for staging injuries, and a laptop with encrypted files detailing the entire scheme, including the forged insurance policies and the plan to fake Caitlin's death if Michael became too suspicious, and that the confession Clark had given in exchange for a reduced sentence had provided the corroboration needed to make the case airtight, ensuring that both would face the full weight of the charges without the possibility of one blaming the other. Michael packed a small bag under police supervision that afternoon, taking only essentials, clothes, laptop, the evidence drive, a few books, and drove to the clinic in Hillsborough where the first chelation session awaited, the foredrip administering DMSA slowly into his vein while a nurse monitored his vitals and explained that the process would bind the remaining thallium and flush it from his system over the coming weeks, though some nerve damage might persist as a permanent reminder of how close he had come to irreversible loss. Sophia arrived that evening, having driven through the rain from Seattle the moment Detective Vasquez cleared it, her embrace in the clinic waiting room carrying the fierce protectiveness that had saved his life from the beginning when she first voiced doubts about Caitlin's intentions, and together they checked into a temporary apartment downtown that the police had arranged for witness protection during the trial preparation, the space small but secure with views of the Willamette River that reminded him of the house he had left behind but without the shadows of deception that had darkened every room. The arrests made local news the next day, headlines about a Black Widow scheme involving poison and staged injuries, with Caitlin's mugshot appearing beside Ryan's and brief mentions of an unnamed victim recovering from chronic exposure, and Michael watched the reports on the apartment's television with a detached fascination, feeling the weight of 3 years lift slightly as the public narrative validated the private hell he had endured, though the emotional recovery proved slower than the physical, with nightmares of green smoothies and fractured bones waking him in the middle of the night and moments of paranoia where he double-checked every drink before sipping even in the safety of the apartment. The trial began 4 months later in a Portland courthouse where the air smelled of polished wood and old paper, the proceedings unfolding over 6 weeks with testimony from Detective Vasquez detailing the investigation's timeline. From the dental x-ray that sparked the initial report to the toxicology results confirming thallium poisoning and the digital forensics linking Caitlin's emails to Ryan with explicit discussions of dosing schedules and payout splits, and when Caitlin took the stand. In her defense, she portrayed herself as the victim of a manipulative partner in Ryan and a paranoid husband in Michael, claiming the supplements were innocent wellness aids and the injuries genuine accidents. But the jury saw through the performance after hearing the recordings Michael had provided where her slips about thallium exposure and suggestions to increase the dose exposed the calculation beneath the care. Ryan's plea deal testimony sealed the verdict, his voice steady as he described how Caitlin had recruited him 2 years earlier with promises of easy money from self-inflicted fractures staged to look accidental, how she had researched thallium as the perfect poison because it mimicked aging and avoided autopsy detection in older victims, how the plan had been to let Michael's health fail slowly enough to collect the forged $1.5 million policy before faking her own death to access the $2.50 million if suspicions arose, and how the dental x-ray had been the unexpected wrench that unraveled everything when Dr. Mendez asked the question that saved Michael's life. The sentencing came on a rainy afternoon in March, the judge delivering a 24-year term for Caitlin on counts of attempted murder, large-scale fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy, citing the premeditated cruelty and exploitation of trust as aggravating factors that warranted no leniency, while Ryan received 9 years as an accomplice with credit for cooperation that had expedited the conviction. And as Caitlin was led away in handcuffs, she glanced back at Michael in the gallery with eyes that held no remorse but a cold assessment as though calculating her next move even from prison. Michael left the courthouse with Sophia by his side, the rain pattering against the umbrella she held over them both as they walked to the car, and although the verdict brought a measure of closure, it did not erase the scars, the burning in his hands and feet that flared on cold days, the memory lapses that caused him to forget names or dates mid-sentence, the trust issues that made every new interaction feel like a potential trap. But it did open the door to healing through thallium. Detoxification treatments that continued weekly at the clinic, where the 4 drips gradually cleared the metal from his system, while therapists helped him process the betrayal in group sessions for victims of emotional and financial abuse. He sold the house by the river shortly after the trial, the place where so many mornings had begun with poisoned smoothies and evenings had ended with deceptive embraces now feeling like a haunted shell he could no longer inhabit, and with Sophia's help he moved into a compact apartment in downtown Portland closer to her university commute when she visited, the new space filled with simple furnishings, A comfortable armchair by the window overlooking the city lights, bookshelves lined with engineering texts and new volumes on resilience and recovery, a small kitchen where he prepared his own meals from scratch for the first time in years. And although the transition was difficult with nights when the silence felt too loud and the absence of Caitlin's presence left a void that was both relief and grief, it marked the beginning of a life reclaimed from the shadows of manipulation. He started attending a support group for middle-aged victims of emotional and financial abuse at a community center near his apartment. The meetings held in a circle of folding chairs under fluorescent lights where strangers shared stories of betrayal by partners, family, or friends who had exploited their vulnerabilities for gain. And although Michael spoke little at first, listening to others describe the gaslighting, the isolation, the slow erosion of self that mirrored his own experience. He gradually opened up about the smoothies, the fractures, the thallium, finding in their nods and empathetic words a solidarity that helped rebuild the trust he had lost not just in Caitlin but in his own judgment for having missed the sign so long. The moral lessons emerged slowly from these sessions and from his private reflections during walks along the Willamette where the river no longer carried the weight of deception but flowed as a reminder of endurance. The most dangerous lie being the one disguised as care and love that lulls you into complacency while the harm accumulates unseen. And how one simple question from a stranger like the dentist can become a lifeline that pulls you back from the edge you didn't know you were on. He learned to never dismiss the intuition of loved ones like Sophia, who had saved her father with her persistent something's not right from the beginning. Her voice the thread that had guided him through the fog when his own had been silenced by poison and doubt. And after such betrayal, trust returns slowly, but it does return if the people who truly love you are by your side, offering patience and presence without the hidden agendas that had poisoned his life before. Every day without poison in his glass became a quiet act of resistance and proof that life is stronger than manipulation. Each breath a small victory over the predator who had nearly claimed him. And as Michael watched the sunset over the river from his new apartment balcony, the colors spreading orange and pink across the water like a promise of renewal, he felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Though the journey toward full healing was far from over and the scars would remain as reminders of how close he had come to losing everything. And as Michael stood on the balcony of his new apartment watching the sunset paint the river in shades of orange and pink that spread across the water like a promise of renewal, he felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Though the journey toward full healing was far from over and the scars would remain as reminders of how close he had come to losing everything. The burning in his extremities that still flared on cold nights now serving as a quiet signal rather than a torment, the occasional memory lapses that caused him to pause mid-sentence becoming moments he could acknowledge with a small laugh and a gentle correction instead of panic. The trust issues that made every new interaction feel like a potential trap gradually softening into cautious openness as he learned to distinguish genuine care from the calculated variety that Caitlin had perfected over 3 years. The months after the trial unfolded in a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply necessary, the apartment downtown becoming a space where he could rebuild without the ghosts of poisoned mornings and deceptive evenings, the large windows letting in the city's light and noise that replaced the river's murmur with a vibrant hum, the kitchen where he prepared simple meals from fresh ingredients bought himself, eggs scrambled with vegetables from the farmer's market, toast with avocado and salt, herbal tea steeped without any added powders, each act of self-nourishment a deliberate affirmation that his body was his own again, no longer a vessel for someone else's agenda. The chelation treatments continued twice weekly at the clinic in Hillsborough until the thallium levels in his blood dropped to undetectable traces after 7 months, the 4 drips becoming less frequent as his body cleared the last remnants. The nurse Maria, who had become a familiar face, offering quiet encouragement during each session, explaining how the chelator bound the metal ions and flushed them through his kidneys, how the lingering neuropathy might fade further with time and physical therapy, how the cognitive effects could improve with consistent sleep and mental exercises. And although some damage remained permanent, the faint tingling in his fingertips when he typed long reports, the occasional word that escaped him during conversations, it no longer defined him but became part of the story he told himself, proof that he had survived something designed to kill quietly and invisibly. Sophia stayed close through it all, her visits shifting from weekends to longer stays during breaks in her graduate program, helping him furnish the apartment with pieces that felt like his own, a sturdy oak desk for engineering work, a soft grey armchair where he could read without remembering Caitlin's throes, bookshelves lined with technical journals and new volumes on resilience and post-trauma growth, and their conversations ranged from the practical details of his recovery to the deeper questions about trust and vulnerability that neither of them had fully explored before the ordeal, her presence a constant reminder that love could exist without hidden motives, that family could be the safety net that caught you when the world tilted, and when she hugged him goodbye each time the embrace carried the weight of gratitude for her persistence that had saved him when his own vision had been clouded by poison and doubt. The support group at the community center became a weekly touchstone, the circle of chairs under fluorescent lights a place where he could speak without fear of judgment, sharing not just the facts of the poisoning and the trial but the quieter aftermath, the nights when he woke reaching for a glass that wasn't there, the moments when a kind gesture from a stranger triggered suspicion instead of gratitude, the slow process of learning to accept help without feeling indebted or controlled, and The others in the group responded with stories of their own lingering effects, the trust issues that made dating feel like walking through a minefield, the hypervigilance that turned every new relationship into a test, the gradual realization that healing was not about erasing the past but integrating it into a stronger version of themselves. He volunteered again at the animal shelter where he and Caitlin had first met, not to erase the memory but to rewrite it, spending Saturday mornings sorting donations and walking dogs along the same trails where he had once jogged with her. The clumsy golden retriever puppy from years ago, now a calm senior dog that greeted him with enthusiastic tail wags and no expectations beyond a treat and attention. The routine providing a gentle rhythm that grounded him in the present instead of the past. And when he told the shelter manager about his recovery without details of the poisoning, the manager simply nodded and said, "Glad you're here." The simple acceptance a balm for the wounds that still ached on quiet days. He returned to consulting work part-time, reviewing bridge retrofit designs from his apartment desk, the calculations and load-bearing assessments that had once been his passion now reclaiming their place in his days, the focus returning slowly as the thallium cleared from his system, the satisfaction of completing a project without second-guessing every line becoming a small triumph that reminded him his mind was still sharp, his expertise still valuable, and that Caitlin had not succeeded in taking that from him even as she had tried to take everything else. The moral lessons settled into him not as grand proclamations but as quiet truths he lived every day. The most dangerous lie is the one disguised as care and love that lulls you into complacency while the harm accumulates unseen. How one simple question from a stranger can become a lifeline that pulls you back from the edge you didn't know you were on. How the intuition of loved ones like Sophia should never be dismissed because it often sees what we are too close or too trusting to recognize. And how after betrayal trust returns slowly, but it does return when the people who truly love you stand beside you with patience and presence free of hidden agendas. He carried these lessons into every new interaction, approaching friendships and potential relationships with the caution of someone who had been burned but without the bitterness that would have closed him off completely, allowing himself to feel hope again in small doses. A shared laugh with a colleague over lunch, a kind word from a neighbor in the hallway, a weekend hike with Sophia where the trail felt like forward motion instead of escape. Each moment a brick in the foundation of a life, rebuilt on his own terms. And as the seasons turned from autumn to winter to spring again, as the river continued its steady flow past the city carrying leaves and memories downstream, Michael found himself standing on the balcony one evening watching the sunset spread orange and pink across the water once more, the colors brighter somehow than they had seemed in the old house, the light reaching places inside him that had been dark for too long. And in that moment he understood that survival was not the end but the beginning, that the scars would always be there but they no longer had to define the shape of his days, that the truth had set him free not by erasing what happened but by giving him the strength to live beyond it. He raised his glass of plain water to the river, to Sophia, to Dr. Mendez, to the stranger's question that had started everything, to himself for choosing to see when it would have been easier to stay blind. And drank deeply, tasting nothing but clear, clean water for the first time in years, the taste of freedom that no poison could ever take away again.